3 months had passed since the river's purification, and Uboku basked in an almost ethereal tranquility. The crops grew with supernatural vigor, their leaves a vibrant green that seemed to glow in the sunlight. The fishermen's nets overflowed with silver catches, and children once again played by the riverbank, their laughter echoing across the water like music from a forgotten paradise. But Linda, now residing in a modest house gifted by the grateful community, couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had settled in her bones like a persistent ache. She had chosen to stay, drawn by an inexplicable sense that her work in Uboku was far from finished. Something whispered in the wind, a voice too faint to understand but too insistent to ignore. It began with the dreams. Not the nightmarish visions of the past, but something subtly different, sins of Uboku from centuries ago. When the land was younger and wilder, she saw figures in flowing white robes performing elaborate ceremonies by the river. Their faces obscured by ornate masks carved from ancient wood, they chanted in a language that predated the local dialects, their voices weaving patterns in the air that seemed to shimmer with otherworldly power. In these dreams, Linda stood among them, but when she looked down at her hands, they weren't her own. They were darker, adorned with intricate scarification that pulsed with a silver light. Around her neck hung an amulet of fish scale, but not like the one from the market. This one was larger, more elaborate, carved with symbols that hurt her eyes to look upon. She would wake with the phantom weight of the amulet heavy against her throat. And sometimes, just sometimes, she could swear she saw the faint outline of those ancient scars on her own arms in the pre-dawn darkness. The stranger's warning on a humid Tuesday morning, as Linda helped Amara's mother tend to their expanded garden. A stranger arrived in Uboku. He was tall and gaunt, his skin bearing the weathered texture of someone who had spent decades under harsh suns. His eyes, a startling pale blue that seemed almost translucent, swept over the thriving village with an expression of profound concern. The man introduced himself as Dr. Emeka Okafor, an anthropologist specializing in West African river cults. He had heard whispers of the events in Uboku from contacts in Lagos, stories that had filtered through academic circles like ripples in still water. Growing more distorted with each telling, "I've come to warn you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "What you've done here, purifying the river, breaking the ancient covenant, it's upset a balance that's been maintained for over 800 years. Linda felt ice form in her veins despite the oppressive heat. "What do you mean? We freed the community from a curse. The river goddess was appeased." Dr. Okafor's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "Appeased, child. You've awakened something that was meant to stay sleeping. The Queen of the Waters wasn't just a local deity, she was a guardian, a sentinel placed here to keep something far more dangerous locked away." He pulled a leather satchel from his shoulder and withdrew a collection of ancient photographs, their edges yellowed and cracked with age. The images showed other rivers across West Africa, the Niger, the Volta, the Senegal, but in each photograph, the water was black as tar, and strange formations jutted from the surface like the spines of sleeping leviathans. Every major river system in this region once had its guardian, Dr. Okafor continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They weren't gods in the traditional sense, they were prisoners, ancient entities bound by cosmic laws to maintain the barriers between our world and elsewhere. Linda's hands trembled as she examined the photographs. In one image from 1923, she could make out what appeared to be massive tentacles writhing just beneath the surface of the Niger River. In another, taken along the Volta in 1956, dark shapes that might have been wings cast shadows on the riverbank despite the cloudless sky above. "The purification ritual you performed," Dr. Okafor said, "it didn't just free the queen from her torment, it released her from her duties as a guardian. And now, the barriers she was meant to maintain are weakening." The first signs, as if summoned by Dr. Okafor's ominous words, the first signs of change began to manifest that very evening. It started with the fish. The abundant catches that had sustained the village's newfound prosperity began to include specimens that defied classification. Fishermen pulled in creatures with too many fins, scales that shifted color in unnatural patterns, and eyes that seemed to track movement with unsettling intelligence. Old Chidi, the village's most experienced fisherman, brought Linda a specimen that made her stomach lurch. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal tilapia, but when she looked closer, She could see that its scales formed patterns, intricate mandalas that hurt to contemplate directly, as if they were trying to convey information that human minds weren't equipped to process. "It spoke to me," Chidi whispered, his weathered face pale with fear. "When I pulled it from the water, before it died, it spoke, not in any language I know, but I understood it anyway. It said, it said, the sleepers are stirring." That night, Linda was visited by more than dreams. As she lay in her bed, hovering, in the space between waking and sleeping, she became aware of a presence in her room. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying scents of deep ocean trenches and prehistoric forests. When she forced her eyes open, she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was herself, or rather, another version of herself. This doppelganger wore the flowing white robes from her dreams, and the scarification on her arms glowed with that same unsettling silver light. The amulet around her neck pulsed like a heart, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "The awakening has begun," the other Linda said, her pale blue eyes that Linda recognized as belonging to someone else, entirely fixed on her with predatory intensity. "The confluence draws near, and the old agreements crumble like sand. You must choose, sister. Will you stand with the tide, or be swept away by it?" Linda tried to speak, to move, to scream, but her body felt as though it were made of lead. The apparition smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "The ceremonies of binding require a willing vessel," it continued, "one who has touched the old powers and survived, one who bears the mark of the guardians. You have been chosen, Linda Okafor, chosen to become what the Queen of the Waters could not." The figure began to fade, but its final words echoed in Linda's mind with terrible clarity. "The rivers are calling, sister. Soon, you will answer." The spreading corruption over the following weeks, the changes in Uboku became impossible to ignore. The river, despite its apparent purity, began to emit strange sounds at night, not the gentle babbling of flowing water, but something that resembled chanting in that same ancient language from Linda's dreams. Villagers reported seeing lights beneath the surface, geometric patterns that pulsed with bioluminescent intensity. The abundant harvests began to take on a sinister quality. Vegetables grew to enormous sizes but developed hollow cores filled with a substance that resembled black honey. When consumed, this substance induced vivid hallucinations and left people speaking in tongues for hours afterward. Children started disappearing, not physically, but mentally. They would be found standing by the river at dawn, their eyes reflecting light like mirrors, speaking in unison about the deep places and the time of joining. Their parents could bring them home, could feed them and clothe them, but some essential spark seemed to have been drained away. Dr. Okafor, who had remained in the village to study these phenomena, presented Linda with his findings. His journal, filled with meticulous observations and sketches, painted a picture of cosmic horror that made the Queen of the Waters seem like a benevolent fairy tale. "The entity that was bound here," he explained, his academic composure cracking to reveal genuine terror, "it's not from our world. My research suggests it's part of something called the Confluence, a convergence of realities that occurs every 800 years. The river guardians weren't just local deities. They were part of a network, a system of locks designed to keep certain doors closed." He showed Linda a map he had constructed, marking the locations of major African rivers, and the dates when their guardian entities had been defeated or appeased over the past century. A disturbing pattern emerged, a spiral of liberation that was moving inexorably toward a central point, a location deep in the Congo basin where, according to legend, all rivers had their ultimate source. "Each time a guardian is removed," Dr. Okafor continued, "the barriers weaken everywhere. And now, with the confluence approaching, those barriers are failing entirely. Things that have been locked away since before human civilization began are stirring, testing their bonds, preparing for freedom." Linda's nights became increasingly tormented. The apparition of her alternate self no longer appeared only in dreams. It followed her into waking moments, flickering in mirrors, glassy water, and even shadows cast on the floor. At first fleeting, the visions grew bolder, lingering longer, mouthing words she couldn't hear but somehow understood deep in her spirit. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, but still, she grew stronger. Beneath her skin, something was changing. Amara noticed it first. "Your eyes," she whispered one morning as Linda washed her face in a basin. "They single quotes re. Different." Linda leaned into the cracked mirror. Her pupils had begun to narrow just slightly but unmistakably, and around the edges of her irises shimmered a ring of silver, like moonlight on a still lake. When she touched her skin, it tingled with electricity. Later that same day, as she walked by the riverbank, the waters parted slightly at her approach, not violently, but in reverence, as if recognizing her. Dr. Oaktefer, now a permanent resident in the village's abandoned schoolhouse, observed her transformation with a mixture of awe and dread. "You're being prepared," he muttered one evening as he lit a kerosene lamp, flipping through pages of a journal so old it cracked with every turn, marked not just by the Queen of the Waters, but by something older, much older. He turned the book to show Linda a faded charcoal drawing. It depicted a woman standing atop a swirling vortex of rivers. Her face was obscured, but her arms bore the same scarification patterns that had haunted Linda's dreams. She was called Erumuna, the first vessel, Dr. Okafor explained, chosen during the last confluence. She bound the ancient forces once, but the cost was her humanity. She became something in between, neither protector nor destroyer, a threshold. "And now," he said, voice trembling, "I believe you are her echo." The river's demand that night. The river called to her, not metaphorically, not in dreams. It spoke. The village was asleep. The moon, swollen and tinged crimson, hung low in the sky. The chanting from the waters had grown louder, now unmistakably rhythmic, now undeniably intelligent. But Linda walked barefoot toward the river, the silverfish in the shallows scattering at her presence. The water glowed faintly, illuminating a narrow path that stretched out toward the deeper current. There, upon a smooth stone island that hadn't existed the day before, stood her doppelganger. "You are ready," it said. "The ritual of return begins tonight. Come." Linda hesitated only a moment. Then she stepped into the river, and the water held her like hands, lifting her, carrying her to the stone platform. Around them, ancient figures began to emerge, shadowy robed silhouettes with bone-white masks and silver tattoos, humming in that impossible language. Some rose from the water, others descended from trees that hadn't been there moments before. The doppelganger stepped forward, holding out the amulet, a larger version of the fish-scale charm from Linda's vision. It hovered in the air between them, pulsing with power. "The gates are weakening. The locks are breaking. You must take the mantle." "What does that mean?" Linda asked. "What happens to me?" "You will become..." The amulet lashed out liquid light, wrapping around Linda's throat, searing into her skin. She screamed, not in pain, but in knowing. Memories not her own flooded her mind. Ancient ceremonies, lost languages, lives lived underwater and in dreams. She saw the original guardians, great beings of light and water and shadow, falling one by one. As humanity forgot the old covenants, she saw what was coming. When the ritual ended, Linda stood taller. Her eyes were silver now, completely. Her skin bore the glowing scars of the guardians, and when she spoke, her voice carried an echo not just hers, but that of all the vessels before her. "I am not only Linda anymore," she whispered. Dr. Okafor met her at the shore, his mouth agape. "What have you done?" "I've accepted what the Queen could not," she replied. "She was never meant to guard the gate alone. The seal was always temporary. A true vessel must carry the boundary within." "Are you still human?" he asked, horrified. She looked past him, toward the village, where flickering lights now rose into the sky beacons, calling something closer. "For now," she said, "but I won't be for long, unless I stop the confluence." "How?" "With one final binding." The next morning, the village awoke to find the river receded by 30 feet, exposing ancient carvings and fossilized remains. The air was heavy with power. Birds flew in chaotic patterns. The sun shone too brightly, casting unnatural shadows. Linda stood at the center of the village square, now transformed. Her clothes shimmered like mist, and around her neck the amulet glowed faintly with a heartbeat rhythm. She raised her hand, and silence fell over the crowd. "The confluence approaches," she said. "What was once locked is stirring, and what was forgotten will soon remember itself. But there is still hope." She turned to Dr. Okafor, who nodded solemnly. "The ritual of return was only the beginning. To stop what is coming, we must go to the source, the place of all rivers." The villagers watched, unsure whether to be terrified or awed. Both. Linda gave a sad smile. "I don't ask for your faith, only your time. If I fail, the world will forget what it means to be whole. But if I succeed, we may survive the tide. And, with that, she began to walk toward the jungle, toward the center of the spiral, toward the heart of all rivers, where the confluence would rise and judgment would fall.